Hunger has a taste. For Elspeth Harrow, it tasted like ash and ice, the kind that settles in your bones and refuses to leave.
You cannot
It
carry
was
this
November
burden
in New York
alone.
City,
It is mine to
1895,
bear.
and the first
Then let
snow of
me
winter
help.
had fallen during the night, covering
Show
the
some
filth of the
respect,
Lower
old
East
man.
Side in a blanket
Let's
of
see what you've
deceptive
got.
purity that would turn to gray slush by noon. She stood outside Fleischmann's Bakery on Mulberry Street, pressed against the warm brick wall where the ovens breathed heat through the mortar. The warmth was a cruelty. It reminded her of everything she couldn't have. 24 years old, 5'6", dark hair that had once been her mother's pride, now unwashed for a week and hidden beneath a threadbare shawl. Her dress was the same one she'd worn to her father's funeral 6 weeks ago. Navy wool carefully mended at the seams, but the hem was muddy and the fabric had begun to thin at the elbows. In her coat pocket, she clutched a single coin. 5 cents, a nickel. The last piece of currency between her and absolute destitution. Inside the bakery, loaves of dark rye bread cooled on wooden racks. She could smell them. Yeast and caraway and salt. Her stomach cramped, a sharp, twisting pain that had become her constant companion. 3 weeks since she'd eaten a full meal. The body, she'd learned, has a way of screaming when you ignore it long enough. The baker appeared in the doorway. Otto Fleischmann, a German immigrant with flour-dusted arms and no patience for poverty. He tossed a bucket of gray water onto the cobblestones, the liquid splashing dangerously close to Elspeth's feet. "Move along, girl," he grunted, not meeting her eyes. "Unless you have coin, you're bad for business." She didn't argue. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She stepped away from the warm wall, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and turned toward the darker alleyways where the rent was cheap and the safety non-existent. The nickel pressed against her palm like a hot coal. Not enough for bread, barely enough for a stale roll, certainly not enough to change her fate. Her father had been a clockmaker. Heinrich Harrow, a German immigrant like Fleischmann, but without Fleischmann's business sense. He'd believed in craftsmanship over commerce, in beauty over profit. His pocket watches were works of art, intricate mechanisms of brass and gold, each gear fitted with microscopic precision. They kept perfect time. They also kept him poor. When the pneumonia took him in October, it left behind debts that devoured everything. $800. To a man like Otto Fleischmann, $800 was 6 months of steady work. To the creditors who came knocking on Elspeth's door, it was a number on a ledger that needed settling. First, they took the furniture. The carved oak table where her father had worked, the chairs her mother had brought from Bavaria, the iron bed frame that had held 3 generations of Harrows. Then they took her mother's locket, the last piece of jewelry in the house gold with a tiny portrait inside. Then they took the roof itself, serving her an eviction notice with all the warmth of a winter wind. She had 3 days left in the tenement apartment, 3 days before she'd be sleeping in the streets if she could find a doorway that wasn't already occupied. 3 days before the cold or the hunger or the desperate men who prowled the alleys would finish what her father's death had started. Elspeth turned the corner onto Hester Street, where the pushcarts sold rotting vegetables and the air smelled of fish and human waste. A carriage clattered past, splashing through a puddle and spraying muddy water across her skirt. She didn't flinch. The dress was already ruined, but the carriage stopped. It was a modest vehicle, black lacquered wood, with no family crest on the door. The kind of carriage a lawyer might use, or a debt collector. Elspeth's heart began to pound. She'd avoided the debt collectors for 2 weeks, staying away from the apartment during the day, sleeping in the building's coal cellar at night. But they'd found her. The door opened. An old man stepped out, 60 perhaps older, with spectacles that caught the weak morning light and a leather portfolio clutched to his chest like a shield. He wore a good wool coat, not expensive but well-maintained. His boots were clean. "Miss Harrow," he called out, his voice carrying across the street with surprising authority. She froze. Fight or flight, her body prepared for both. But where would she run, and what would she fight with? "I have no money, sir," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you've come to collect on the final note, you can take the shawl. That's all that remains." The old man shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He gestured to the dry interior of the carriage. "I am not here to collect, Miss Harrow. I am here with a proposition. One that is highly unorthodox, but given your current state, perhaps viable." A proposition. In Elspeth's experience, propositions made to desperate young women on the streets of the Lower East Side had only one meaning. But this man didn't have the look of a brothel keeper, and she was too hungry to care about dignity. She climbed into the carriage. The interior was warm, clean. The seats were leather, worn but not cracked. There was a small coal brazier on the floor, barely glowing but throwing enough heat to make her fingers tingle as feeling returned to them. The door closed behind her with a solid thunk, sealing out the noise of the street. The old man settled across from her, arranging his portfolio on his lap. Up close, she could see the deep lines around his eyes, the age spots on his hands. A working man who'd risen to middle management through decades of careful service. "My name is Abraham Thorne," he said, pulling a document from his portfolio. "I am a solicitor. I handle estates and contracts for families in Connecticut." Connecticut, where the old money lived in sprawling estates with names instead of addresses, where a working man might labor his entire life and never set foot inside the front door. "I don't understand," Elspeth said carefully. "I have no estate. I have no contract." "No," Thorne agreed, "but you have something my client desperately needs. You have poverty, Miss Harrow, and you have desperation, and in this particular circumstance, those qualities make you invaluable." He slid the document across to her, legal language dense and impenetrable, but at the top, written in elegant script, "Marriage contract." Elspeth's breath caught. "I don't—" "You know of Baron Nathaniel Ashwood?" Thorne interrupted. It wasn't a question. She did. Everyone in New York knew of Baron Ashwood, or knew the rumors at least. The ruined Baron of Ravencrest Manor in Connecticut. The gambler who had lost everything at the card tables. The recluse who lived in a crumbling, Gothic monstrosity with half the windows boarded up, and servants who fled after a single week of employment. They said he was mad. They said he talked to himself in the library, that he smashed valuable things in fits of rage, that he'd once thrown a valet down the stairs for bringing the wrong wine. They said his fortune was gone, gambled away to creditors and confidence men, leaving nothing but debts and a title that meant nothing in America anyway. "The ruined Baron," Elspeth said slowly. "The one who gambled away his fortune." Thorne nodded. "The rumors are exaggerated, though I'll admit his financial ruin is quite real. But there's a clause in his grandfather's will. To retain the title and the Ravencrest estate worthless as it currently is, he must be married by his 30th birthday." "When is his birthday?" "Tomorrow, at midnight." Elspeth stared at him. "You want me to marry a madman I've never met to help him keep an estate that's falling apart, and you want me to do it in less than 24 hours?" "Yes." "Why me?" Thorne's expression softened just slightly. "Because you're desperate enough to say yes, and because you have no family to object. No friends to talk you out of it. No prospects that would be ruined by association with a social pariah." He paused. "He cannot pay you a fortune, Miss Harrow. He has none. But he offers food, shelter, and protection. And I am authorized to settle your father's debts in full. $800, the number that had consumed her life for 6 weeks. The weight that had pushed her to the edge of starvation and homelessness. Thorne was offering to make it disappear with the stroke of a pen. "What's the alternative?" Elspeth asked, though she already knew the answer. Thorne didn't sugarcoat it. "The alternative is that in 3 days you'll be evicted. In a week you'll be in one of the tenements on Cherry Street if you're lucky. In a month—" He trailed off. They both knew what happened to young women with no money and no options in New York City. The carriage was warm. Outside snow had begun to fall again, thick flakes that would turn the streets into freezing mud. Elspeth thought of the coal cellar where she'd been sleeping, of the rats that scurried across her feet, in the dark of the hollow ache in her belly that never fully went away. She thought of her father's hands, so precise and gentle, when he worked with the tiny gears and springs of his clocks. She thought of his optimism, his belief that quality would eventually be rewarded. She thought of how wrong he'd been and how that wrongness had killed him. "Will I be safe?" she asked. Thorne hesitated. The hesitation told her everything. "Baron Ashwood is not a violent man," he said carefully. "He's abrasive, certainly, reclusive, poor. But he has never raised a hand to his servants despite the rumors. You will have your own quarters, your own space. The marriage is legal, but it need not be consummated if that's your concern." "That wasn't my concern," Elspeth said quietly. "My concern is whether I'm trading one form of death for another." "Perhaps," Thorne admitted, "but at Ravencrest you'll die warm and fed. Here you'll die in the gutter. If those are the only choices available, Miss Harrow, which would you prefer?" She looked out the window at the gray streets, at the pushcarts and the beggars, and the endless crushing weight of poverty that ground people down until there was nothing left but bones and regret. "I accept," she whispered. Thorne nodded as if he'd never doubted her answer. He produced a pen and a small inkwell from his portfolio, setting them on the seat between them. "Sign here," he said, pointing to a line at the bottom of the contract. "And here. The ceremony will take place tonight at a small church in Connecticut. Very private. No guests. By midnight, you'll be the Baroness Ashwood." Elspeth signed. The ink was black and permanent. Her hand didn't shake. The journey to Ravencrest took 4 hours. They traveled north by train, the landscape changing from the cramped brick tenements of Manhattan to the rolling hills and bare trees of Connecticut. The further they went from the city, the more the world seemed to open up. Space, land, things Elspeth had forgotten existed beyond the narrow confines of the Lower East Side. Thorne dozed in his seat, his chin resting on his chest, his breath fogging slightly in the cold air of the train car. Elspeth didn't sleep. She watched the countryside roll past, trying to imagine what kind of man would need to marry a stranger to keep his inheritance. Trying to imagine what kind of life awaited her in a crumbling manor with a reclusive, possibly mad baron. The train deposited them at a small station in a town called Millbrook. A carriage was waiting, not Thorne's modest vehicle, but something larger and older, with chipped paint and a single horse that looked as underfed as Elspeth felt. The driver was a hulking man with a scarred face and hands the size of dinner plates. He didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge them. Just loaded Thorne's bags and gestured for them to climb aboard. The road to Ravencrest was barely a road at all. More of a path, rutted and overgrown, winding through dense forest that seemed to swallow the weak afternoon light. The trees pressed in on both sides, their bare branches scratching against the carriage roof like skeletal fingers. Then the forest opened up, and Elspeth saw her new home. Ravencrest Manor rose from the landscape like a monument to decay. It was massive, 3 stories of dark stone, covered in aggressive ivy that had claimed half the facade. The windows on the upper floors were boarded shut with rough planks. The ones on the ground floor were dark, catching no reflection from the gray sky. The roof sagged in places, and one of the chimneys had partially collapsed, spilling bricks across the slate tiles. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a place where things went to die. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the main entrance. The double doors were solid oak, 12 feet tall, but the paint had peeled away in long strips, and one of the brass handles was missing. Thorne climbed down first, then offered his hand to help Elspeth. Her legs were stiff from the journey. Her feet ached, but she stood straight, lifting her chin, refusing to show fear. The door opened before they could knock. A woman stood in the entrance. 60 years old, perhaps older, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 secrets. She wore a simple black dress with a white apron, a housekeeper's uniform, though the fabric was worn and the apron had been mended multiple times. "Mr. Thorne," the woman said, her voice a low rasp, "and this must be the bride." "Seraphina," Thorne replied with a small bow. "May I present Miss Elspeth Harrow, soon to be Lady Ashwood." Seraphina's eyes traveled over Elspeth, slowly taking in the muddy hem of her dress, the worn shawl, the hollow cheeks. No judgment in that gaze, just assessment. "You're younger than I expected," Seraphina said. "You're kinder than I expected," Elspeth replied. The corner of Seraphina's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Don't mistake efficiency for kindness, girl. Come inside. The master is waiting in the hall." The interior of Ravencrest was as decayed as the exterior suggested. The entrance hall was vast marble floors, cracked and stained wallpaper, peeling in long strips, a chandelier hanging at an angle with half its crystals missing. The air smelled of dust and damp and something else, something darker. Neglect, perhaps, or despair. A single candle burned on a side table, its flame barely pushing back the shadows. And in those shadows stood a man. He had his back to them, facing the massive fireplace at the far end of the hall. The fire had gone out, only cold ash remained in the grate. He wore a coat that had once been fine velvet, deep burgundy, with gold buttons, but the elbows were threadbare, and one of the buttons was missing. His shoulders were broad, his posture rigid. "So," he said, his voice resonating through the hall like a hammer on stone, "this is the desperate soul willing to chain herself to a sinking ship." He turned. Nathaniel Ashwood was not what Elspeth expected. The rumors had painted him as mad, as broken as a shell of a man consumed by vice and failure. But the man who faced her now was none of those things. He was tall, at least 6 feet, with the build of someone who'd known physical labor or military service. His face was angular and hard-carved from the same stone as the manor itself. Dark hair slightly too long falling across his forehead. And eyes, God, those eyes black as coal and utterly devoid of hope. They held the kind of exhaustion that comes not from sleeplessness, but from carrying a weight too heavy to bear. And the scar, a thick raised line of tissue that ran from his jaw down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. Not the neat scar of a surgeon's knife, the ragged scar of violence. He looked at Elspeth the way a man might look at a horse he was considering purchasing, evaluating, calculating, seeing not a person but a piece in whatever game he was playing. I am Elspeth, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. And I am not chaining myself to a ship, my lord. I am merely looking for a raft to keep from drowning. Something flickered in those dead eyes. Not warmth, not kindness, but recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement of one survivor by another. Nathaniel let out a dry, humorless laugh. A pragmatist. Good. Love has no place in this house, Miss Harrow, and neither does pity. He strode across the hall, his boots echoing on the cracked marble, and tossed a quill onto the table beside the candle. Next to it, a single sheet of paper. The marriage contract. Sign the papers, he said, and the kitchen will find you some soup. No ceremony, no kindness, just a business transaction between two people who had nothing left to lose. Elspeth picked up the quill. The nib was worn, the ink faded, but it would do. She signed her name, Elspeth Harrow, in letters that looked small and fragile next to the bold script of Nathaniel's signature already on the document. When she set down the quill, Nathaniel was already walking away, heading toward a door at the back of the hall. Your room is in the west wing, he said without looking back. Serafina will show you. We leave for the church at 10. Don't be late. Then he was gone, disappearing through the door and closing it behind him with a finality that echoed through the empty hall. Serafina placed a hand on Elspeth's shoulder. The touch was brief, but not unkind. Come, the older woman said. I'll show you to your quarters, and I'll find you something to eat. The west wing was in better condition than the rest of the manor, though that wasn't saying much. The hallway was lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women in outdated clothing, the Ashwood ancestors Elspeth assumed watching from their frames with expressions of perpetual disapproval. Her room was at the end of the hall, a modest space with a four-poster bed draped in heavy curtains, a wardrobe that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, and a single window that overlooked the overgrown gardens behind the manor. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, and the air smelled of disuse. But the roof didn't leak. The window had glass. And when Serafina lit the fire in the small hearth, warmth began to spread through the room like a blessing. I'll bring you soup, Serafina said, moving toward the door. And bread. You look like you haven't eaten in a week. 3 weeks, Elspeth admitted. But who's counting? Serafina paused in the doorway, her expression unreadable. The master isn't kind, girl. He's not cruel either. He's just absent, like a ghost in his own house. You'll rarely see him. He spends his days and nights in the library, and he doesn't like to be disturbed. What's he doing in there? I don't know, reading perhaps, writing letters, breaking things when the mood strikes him. Serafina's eyes darkened. This house has secrets, Elspeth, and some of them are dangerous. If you're smart, you'll keep to yourself. Do your duty. Stay out of his way. She left before Elspeth could ask what duty she was expected to perform. Alone in the room, Elspeth sank onto the bed. The mattress was thin, the sheets musty, but it was a bed. A real bed. Not a coal cellar floor, not a doorway in an alley. She pressed her hands to her face and felt the tears come. Not from sadness, not from fear, from relief. The kind of relief that comes when the drowning finally stops, even if you're not sure you've reached shore. Serafina returned 30 minutes later with a tray. A bowl of potato soup, thick and steaming. A hunk of dark bread still warm from the oven. A cup of water. Elspeth ate slowly, savoring every bite. The soup was simple but well made. The bread was dense and filling. She felt strength returning to her body with each mouthful, the gnawing ache in her stomach finally blessedly beginning to ease. Thank you, she said when the bowl was empty. Serafina collected the tray. Save your thanks. You'll need them later. What do you mean? But Serafina was already gone, the door closing softly behind her. Elspeth lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling. Cracks spider-webbed across the plaster. In the distance, she heard a door slam. Then footsteps, heavy, restless, pacing back and forth in the room above hers. Nathaniel, the man she would marry in a few hours. The stranger who had bought her survival with a contract and a bowl of soup. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about what she'd just agreed to. The ceremony took place at 10 o'clock that night in a small stone church 5 miles from Ravencrest. The building was old, older than the manor, with stained glass windows that caught no light in the darkness. Inside, a single priest waited, ancient and bent, holding a prayer book with shaking hands. No guests, no witnesses beyond Thorn and Serafina. No music, no flowers, no celebration. Elspeth wore the same navy dress she'd signed the contract in. Nathaniel wore the threadbare velvet coat. They stood before the altar, not touching, not looking at each other. The priest spoke the words, traditional vows stripped of poetry or romance. Do you take this man? Do you take this woman? in sickness and health, till death. I do, Elspeth said. I do, Nathaniel said. The priest pronounced them man and wife, no kiss, no ring. Just a piece of paper signed and witnessed making legal what desperation had already decided. They rode back to Ravencrest in silence. The carriage rattled over the rough road, the single lantern swaying with each bump. Nathaniel stared out the window at the dark forest. Elspeth stared at her hands, now marked with ink stains from signing her new name, Elspeth Ashwood. At the manor, Nathaniel climbed out first. He didn't offer his hand. Your room is where you left it, he said. I suggest you sleep. Tomorrow we have work to do. Work. But he was already walking away, his long strides carrying him across the entrance hall and up the stairs, disappearing into the darkness of the upper floors. Serafina appeared at Elspeth's elbow. Come, I'll show you back to your room. What did he mean, work? I don't know, my lady. The master doesn't confide in servants. My lady, the title sounded absurd. Elspeth Harrow, daughter of a poor clockmaker, was now Lady Ashwood, baroness of a crumbling estate with no fortune and a husband who looked at her like she was a chess piece to be moved at his convenience. Sleep did not come easily that night. Elspeth lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of the house, the wind rattling the windows, the creak of old wood settling. And above her, always above her, the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth like a caged animal testing the limits of its prison. At some point, she heard glass shatter, a roar of frustration, then silence. She pulled the blankets tighter and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion finally claimed her. The first week at Ravencrest was a study in isolation. The house was vast and mostly empty. Room after room stood unused furniture covered in sheets, doors locked or simply abandoned. The east wing was uninhabitable. Roof damage had let in rain for years, and entire sections of the floor had rotted through. The ground floor was manageable, though only barely. The upper floors were a maze of locked doors and darkened hallways where dust lay thick as snow. Elspeth saw Nathaniel exactly 3 times that week. Once on the second morning when she encountered him in the hallway outside the library. He was carrying a stack of letters, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, ink staining his fingers. He looked at her as if trying to remember who she was, then nodded once and continued past without a word. Once on the 4th day when she heard shouting from the library and opened the door to find him standing amid shattered glass, a decanter lying in pieces at his feet. He'd cut his hand, blood dripped onto the Turkish rug black in the dim light. When he saw her, his expression went cold. Get out, he said quietly. She got out. Once on the 7th day when she found him standing on the balcony overlooking the gardens at dawn. He wore no coat despite the freezing temperature. The scar on his neck was visible, livid against his pale skin. She didn't speak, didn't approach. Just watched as he stared at the overgrown roses and broken fountains as if seeing something she couldn't. The rest of the time he was locked in the library. She heard him sometimes, the scratch of pen on paper, the thud of books being moved, that endless pacing that went on until the small hours of the morning. Serafina became her only companion. The older woman ran the household with brutal efficiency despite the lack of resources. She cooked simple meals, potato stew, dark bread, occasionally a bit of salt pork or dried fish. She kept the inhabited rooms clean. She mended Elspeth's dress and found her a second one in a wardrobe upstairs, faded blue cotton, that had belonged to someone else, someone from before. Was there a wife before me? Elspeth asked one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen peeling potatoes for dinner. Serafina's knife paused for just a moment. No. A fiancé once. 5 years ago. It didn't end well. What happened? That's not my story to tell, my lady. Elspeth set down her knife. Please don't call me that. My name is Elspeth. Serafina looked at her with something that might have been respect. Very well, Elspeth, but in front of others I'll use your title. It's proper. Are there others? I've seen no one but you and the groundskeeper. Silas. He's mute. Lost his tongue in the war, but he's loyal. Serafina resumed peeling. There used to be more staff, a valet, a lady's maid, a cook, 2 footmen. They all left. Couldn't stand the isolation, or the master's moods, or the rumors. What rumors? That he's mad, that he killed a man in a duel, that he's cursed. Serafina's voice was flat matter of fact. People fear what they don't understand, and your husband Elspeth is not an easy man to understand. That night, Elspeth's curiosity got the better of her caution. She waited until the house was dark, until even Nathaniel's pacing had stopped. Then she crept down the hallway to the library door. It was locked as always, but the keyhole was large, old-fashioned, the kind you could see through if you were brave enough to look. She knelt and pressed her eye to the opening. The library was massive, 2 stories tall, with a gallery running around the upper level. Shelves lined every wall filled with leather-bound books that had probably cost more than her father's entire inventory. A desk stood in the center of the room covered in papers and maps and what looked like coded messages. Candles burned everywhere, dozens of them, their light casting wild shadows across the vaulted ceiling. And at the desk, still dressed despite the late hour, sat Nathaniel. He was writing, not the casual writing of a letter, but the fevered scrawl of a man possessed. His hand moved across the page with desperate speed, pausing only to dip the pen in ink before continuing. Pages lay scattered around him, some filled with words, others with diagrams and calculations she couldn't decipher. As she watched, he stopped, set down the pen, picked up one of the coded messages, and held it close to the candle, reading it with an intensity that made her shiver. Then he spoke, not to himself, to someone who wasn't there. "I know you're watching," he said quietly. "I know you think you've won, but you haven't calculated for the one variable you can't control." He set down the message and picked up another. This one he fed into the candle flame, watching it burn. "Patience," he whispered to the ashes. "Patience and time. That's all I need. Time and the right piece in the right place." Elspeth jerked back from the keyhole, her heart hammering. She'd heard enough, seen enough. Serafina was right. This house had secrets, and she was now part of them, whether she wanted to be or not. She fled back to her room and lay awake until dawn, listening to the footsteps above her head and wondering what kind of game she'd agreed to play. The answer came on the 8th day when everything changed. She was in the kitchen with Serafina learning to make bread. The older woman had decided that if Elspeth was going to live at Ravencrest, she needed to be useful. They were kneading dough when they heard the sound of horses on the drive. Not the single tired horse that pulled the groundskeeper's cart. Multiple horses, moving fast. Serafina's hands stilled. Were not expecting anyone. They moved to the window. Through the grimy glass, Elspeth saw 3 carriages pulling up to the front entrance. Expensive carriages with family crests on the doors and liveried drivers. The kind of vehicles that belonged to people who never set foot in places like Ravencrest. The door to the first carriage opened, and a man stepped out. He was in his early 40s, well-fed and well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. His coat was cashmere. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his face held an expression of absolute contempt as he surveyed the decaying manor. "Who is that?" Elspeth whispered. Serafina's face had gone pale. "Cornelius Graves, Lord of the Eastern Railroad Trust. He's one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut." "What's he doing here?" Before Serafina could answer, the front door flew open with a crash that echoed through the house. Graves strode into the entrance hall as if he owned it, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits. Lawyers probably, or accountants. He looked around at the peeling wallpaper, the cracked marble, the general decay, and his lip curled in disgust. "Where is he?" Graves bellowed, his voice filling the space. "Where is the pauper baron?" Elspeth found herself moving without thinking, leaving the kitchen and walking toward the entrance hall. Serafina tried to grab her arm, hissed, "Don't!" But Elspeth shook her off. She emerged into the hall just as Nathaniel appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked terrible. He'd clearly been working all night. His shirt was untucked, his hair disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed. But when he saw Graves, something shifted in his expression. The exhaustion fell away like a mask replaced by something cold and calculating. "Get out of my house, Graves," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet but carrying perfect authority. Graves laughed, a booming, cruel sound. "Your house, this ruin? This isn't a house, Ashwood. This is a monument to your failure." He pulled a document from his coat and held it up. "I've just purchased the mortgage on Ravencrest from the bank. Congratulations, you've missed 3 payments. You're in default, and I'm here to collect." Elspeth felt the blood drain from her face. This was it, the eviction Thorne had warned about, the end of her brief respite from poverty. But Nathaniel didn't flinch. He descended the stairs slowly, each step measured and deliberate, until he stood face to face with Graves at the bottom. "You bought the debt," Nathaniel said. It wasn't a question. "How much did you pay?" "More than this pile of stones is worth. But it'll be worth it to watch you grovel." Graves smiled. "I'm giving you until sunset tomorrow to vacate. Then I'm burning this eyesore to the ground and building a proper hunting lodge on the land." Nathaniel stared at him for a long moment. Then something happened that Elspeth would replay in her mind 1,000 times in the days to come. Nathaniel smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a kind smile, a smile like a blade being drawn from a sheath. "You bought the debt," he repeated softly. "You paid a premium for the pleasure of watching me fall. You think you've bought a leash, Graves, but you've merely grabbed a tiger's tail." Graves' smile faltered. Is that a threat? It's a warning. Nathaniel's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. Get off my land, or I will ensure that by tomorrow evening the name Graves is synonymous with ash. For a moment, just a moment, fear flickered across Graves's face. Then he recovered, forced out another laugh. Big words for a man with holes in his boots, Ashwood. Sunset tomorrow. Pack your bags. He turned on his heel and strode out, his lawyers scurrying after him. The carriages departed in a cloud of dust and gravel, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Silence returned to the hall. Nathaniel stood completely still, staring at the door. Elspeth could see his hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. Then he turned and looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since their wedding night. Pack a trunk, he said. Elspeth's heart stuttered. Are we leaving away? No. His eyes burned with sudden intense fire. We're going to New York. It seems the timeline has moved up. I can't wait for the harvest anymore. New York, with what money? Graves owns the debt. We have nothing. Nathaniel crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. He grabbed her shoulders, not roughly, but firmly. Grounding. Do you trust me? He asked. I don't know you. Good. Something that might have been approval flashed in his eyes. That makes you safer. Now pack the blue dress you wore to the wedding and bring the locket you hide under your pillow. Elspeth froze. The locket. Her mother's locket. The one the creditors had supposedly taken. She'd found it in the wardrobe in her room 3 days ago, hidden in a drawer, and had been wearing it to sleep ever since. How did you know about the locket? She whispered. Nathaniel released her shoulders and stepped back. The exhaustion was gone now, replaced by razor-sharp alertness. I make it my business to know everything about the assets I acquire, he said. And you, my dear wife, are the most valuable asset I have. He disappeared into the library, leaving Elspeth standing alone in the entrance hall, her mind reeling. Assets, variables, tigers and leashes. What kind of game was Nathaniel playing, and what role had she just been assigned? She ran upstairs to her room and found Serafina already there, pulling a worn traveling trunk from the wardrobe. You knew, Elspeth said. You knew this was coming. Serafina nodded. The Masters had been planning for weeks, waiting for Graves to make his move, and now he has. Planning what? The older woman's expression was grim. Revolution, girl. Your husband isn't the ruined baron everyone thinks he is, and by tomorrow night the entire city of New York is going to know it. She handed Elspeth the blue dress and stepped back. Pack quickly. And whatever happens in the next 24 hours, whatever you see, whatever you learn, remember this. Nathaniel Ashwood is many things. Matt is not one of them. The train to New York departed at dawn. Elspeth sat in the second-class compartment, watching the Connecticut countryside blur past the grimy window. Frost covered the fields in crystalline sheets that caught the weak morning light and transformed the landscape into something almost beautiful. Almost. Across from her, Nathaniel sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and measured. To anyone else, he appeared to be sleeping. But Elspeth had learned to read the small tells, the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers rested on his knee in a rhythm that wasn't random. He was counting, calculating, planning. The blue dress lay folded in the trunk at their feet. The locket hung around her neck, hidden beneath the collar of her traveling dress. Everything she owned in the world fit in a single small case. It should have made her feel insignificant. Instead, it made her feel light, untethered, ready to run, or ready to fight. The train rattled over a bridge, the sound changing as they crossed the Harlem River. Manhattan rose in the distance, a forest of buildings clawing at the sky, smokestacks pumping gray clouds into the winter air. Somewhere in that tangle of steel and stone, her father had died. Somewhere in those streets, she'd stood outside Fleischmann's bakery with a single nickel and no hope. That had been 8 days ago. It felt like a lifetime. Nathaniel's eyes opened. Not the slow blink of someone waking, but the instant alertness of a soldier snapping to attention. We're here, he said. The carriage that met them at Grand Central Station was nothing like the shabby vehicle from Ravencrest. This was sleek, black lacquered, pulled by 2 matching bay horses that looked like they'd cost more than most men earned in a year. The driver wore proper livery, not the worn, faded kind that Silas used, but crisp and new and expensive. Elspeth stared. I thought you were broke. I am. Nathaniel handed her into the carriage with surprising courtesy. Baron Nathaniel Ashwood is a pauper who can barely afford bread, but Baron Ashwood has friends who aren't quite so destitute. Friends, he didn't answer. The carriage rolled through the streets of Manhattan, heading not toward the Lower East Side where Elspeth expected but uptown. Past the tenements and factories, past the middle-class neighborhoods with their tidy brownstones into the realm of the wealthy. They stopped in front of a narrow townhouse on a quiet street near Central Park. From the outside, it looked abandoned, paint-peeling shutters closed a general air of neglect. But when Nathaniel unlocked the front door, the interior told a different story. The house was fully furnished, not lavishly but comfortably, clean, maintained. And as they stepped inside, two servants appeared from the back rooms, a man and a woman, both middle-aged, both moving with the silent efficiency of professionals. "Your Grace," the man said with a small bow, "Your Grace, not my lord, not Baron Ashwood. Your Grace," the address reserved for dukes. Elspeth's breath caught. She turned to Nathaniel, questions forming on her lips, but he was already stripping off his worn coat and handing it to the waiting valet. Beneath the shabby exterior, he wore a shirt of fine white linen. Italian, probably. Worth more than her father's entire wardrobe. "Elspeth," he said quietly, "I need you to sit down." She didn't sit. She stood in the middle of the entrance hall, her mind racing, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with terrible clarity. The coded messages. The letters arriving at midnight. The way he looked at Graves, not with fear, but with cold anticipation. The servants who called him Your Grace. "You're not a baron," she said. "No, you never were. I was once. Baron was my courtesy title, before I inherited." "Inherited what?" Nathaniel met her eyes. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something other than exhaustion or rage in that dark gaze. She saw resolve. And beneath it buried deep something that might have been grief. "The Duchy of Ashwood," he said quietly. "I am, or I was, Duke Nathaniel Ashwood, fifth of my name, wealthiest peer in the northeastern states before I vanished 5 years ago." The room tilted slightly. Elspeth reached for the wall to steady herself. "You're the missing duke," she whispered. "The one everyone thought was dead, or exiled, or a traitor to the nation," Nathaniel finished. "Yes, that one." He moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of brandy, handed one to Elspeth. She took it automatically, her hands shaking. "Sit," he said again. "Please, I'll explain everything. But you need to sit." This time she sat. Nathaniel remained standing, the brandy untouched in his hand. He stared at it for a long moment, then set it down and began to speak. "5 years ago, my father was the Duke of Ashwood, Edmund Ashwood. He was a good man, honest, believed in duty and honor and all the things they teach you when you're raised with a title and money." His voice was flat, emotionless, reciting facts. He also believed in fiscal responsibility, which is why when he was appointed to oversee a federal audit of the Treasury Department, he took the job seriously. Elspeth sipped the brandy. It burned going down, but it steadied her nerves. "He found discrepancies," Nathaniel continued. $2 million that should have been in the Federal Reserve but weren't. Falsified reports, forged signatures, a scheme so elaborate it had been running for years without anyone noticing. And at the center of it all was one man. Hutam Maxwell Thornfield, Secretary of the Treasury, one of the most powerful men in the United States government. The name meant nothing to Elspeth, but the way Nathaniel said it with such controlled hatred made her shiver. "My father compiled evidence," Nathaniel said. "Months of work, documents, bank records, testimony from witnesses. He was planning to present it to President McKinley. He scheduled a meeting for November 15th, 1890. What happened? He went hunting on November 14th, a private estate in upstate New York. Very exclusive, just a few friends. Thornfield was one of them." Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists. "There was an accident, a tragic accident. My father's rifle misfired during a deer hunt. The bullet went through his chest. He died within minutes." "But it wasn't an accident." "No, it was murder. Clean, professional, made to look like carelessness." Nathaniel finally picked up his brandy and drank it in one swallow. "Thornfield didn't stop there. Within days, rumors started spreading that my father had been the one embezzling, that the audit had been his way of covering his tracks, that I, his heir, his son, had been helping him, gambling away the stolen money at card tables and racetracks. Why didn't you fight it? I tried. I went to the newspapers with evidence. They were paid off or threatened. I went to other politicians. They closed ranks around Thornfield. I went to the police." He laughed bitterly. "That's when they came for me with an arrest warrant. Treason, conspiracy, embezzlement. I was 25 years old and facing the gallows." "So you ran." "I staged my own death, burned down the townhouse I was staying in, left enough of a corpse, not mine, a body, from the morgue to make it convincing. And then I disappeared. became the ruined Baron Ashwood living in a decaying manor in Connecticut, mad and broken and harmless. Elspeth set down her glass. For 5 years. For 5 years, I've been building a network. Spies, informants, allies who believe in justice over politics. Learning Thornfield's organization. Finding his weaknesses. Waiting for the right moment to strike. And Graves is Thornfield's banker, the man who launders the stolen money and makes it clean. Break Graves and Thornfield's funding dries up. Break Thornfield. Nathaniel's smile was cold and sharp, and the entire house of cards collapses. Elspeth stood pacing the small room. Her mind raced, connecting dots, seeing the pattern. The marriage, she said slowly. You needed me because a reclusive bachelor living alone in a crumbling manor is suspicious. But a poor baron married to a desperate girl from the slums, that's just a tragedy. A footnote, something no one pays attention to. I was your disguise. You were my perfect cover. Nathaniel met her eyes. But you're also the reason I can move now instead of waiting another year. Graves' threatening eviction forced my hand. I'd planned to spend months more gathering evidence against Thornfield. Now I have days. To do what? To destroy Cornelius Graves, publicly, completely, and in doing so cut off Thornfield's access to clean money. He moved to a desk in the corner, pulled out a leather portfolio, and spread papers across the surface. Tonight, Graves is hosting high-stakes poker at the Pembroke Mansion. The wealthiest men in New York will be there. I'm going to take everything he has, and I need you to help me. Elspeth looked at the papers, financial documents, shipping manifests, what looked like coded telegrams. I don't know anything about poker, she said. You don't need to. I need you to watch the room, to read the men. Nathaniel's gaze was intense. I learned to play cards in the army. I'm good. But the game isn't won at the table. It's won by knowing your opponent, reading their tells, understanding what they fear. And you think I can do that? I know you can. You read me on our wedding night. When I said love had no place in this house, you didn't flinch, didn't cry. You evaluated the situation and chose your response strategically. That takes observation, intelligence, the ability to see past the surface. He was right. She'd always been good at reading people. It had been a survival skill on the Lower East Side, knowing which shopkeepers might give credit, which landlords would accept late payment, which men to avoid in dark alleys. What do you need me to do? She asked. Nathaniel pulled out a dress box from beneath the desk. First, you need to look the part. The dress was emerald green silk, 3 seasons out of fashion, with a modest neckline and slightly dated sleeves. But it was beautiful and expensive. The kind of dress a baron's wife might wear if she were trying and failing to maintain appearances. Perfect, Nathaniel said when she emerged from the dressing room an hour later. The servants had helped her into it, pinned her dark hair up in an elegant style, and even found a necklace, paste emeralds, not real but convincing from a distance. She looked like she belonged in the world she was about to enter. Almost. You need to understand something, Nathaniel said as the carriage rolled toward the Pembroke Mansion that evening. The men at this game aren't just wealthy. They're predators. They've built their fortunes on the backs of people like you and me. People they consider beneath them. Disposable. People like my father. Yes. He looked at her in the dim light of the carriage lamp. They'll see you as a curiosity, a desperate girl who married a desperate man. They'll say cruel things. They'll mock you to your face. You need to let them. Can you do that? Elspeth thought of the baker who'd thrown water at her feet, the landlord who'd evicted her, the creditors who'd taken her mother's locket. She'd survived worse than words. I can do that, she said. Good. Nathaniel handed her a small card. On it, a simple code. Observe the men at the table, especially Graves. Look for these signs. If you see them, touch your necklace once for fear, twice for lies, 3 times for desperation. I'll be watching you, not them. Understand, she memorized the code. Dilated pupils, rapid blinking, checking the time repeatedly, touching the throat. All signs of stress, anxiety, deception. What if I'm wrong, she asked. Then we lose, and Graves burns a raven crest to the ground tomorrow at sunset. The Pembroke Mansion blazed with light like a cathedral in the darkness. Every window glowed. The sound of music and laughter spilled out into the winter night. Carriages lined the circular drive, disgorging men in evening wear and women in gowns that cost more than Elspeth's father had earned in his lifetime. The footman who opened their carriage door looked at Nathaniel's worn coat and barely concealed his sneer. Announcement, he asked, his tone making it clear he didn't expect these shabby visitors to merit one. Baron Nathaniel Ashwood of Ravencrest, Nathaniel said quietly, and the Baroness Elspeth Ashwood. The footman's eyebrows rose, but he recovered quickly. This way, sir, madam. The entrance hall of the Pembroke mansion was everything Ravencrest was not. New, polished, gleaming with wealth. Crystal chandeliers, marble columns, gilt-framed mirrors, reflecting candlelight in 1,000 dancing flames. The air smelled of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and old money. And when the butler announced them, Baron Ashwood of Ravencrest and the Baroness Ashwood, the room fell silent. Not the respectful silence that greets honored guests, the cruel silence of predators spotting prey. Then the whispers started, cutting, deliberate, meant to be heard. Look at him, dragging that poor girl into the lion's den. She's pretty enough, shame she'll be in the poorhouse by morning. Did you see his coat? I wouldn't let my valet wear that. Desperate times, desperate measures. I heard he married her for the dowry, but what dowry could a girl like that have? Elspeth felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her chins on her hands steady on Nathaniel's arm. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She'd been hungry and cold and afraid. Words couldn't hurt her anymore. They moved through the crowd. The sea of silk and diamonds parted reluctantly, as if afraid poverty might be contagious. And then near the massive fireplace, Elspeth saw him. Cornelius Graves. He was holding court with a glass of brandy in one hand, laughing at something one of his sycophants had said. When he saw them, his smile widened into something predatory. Ashwood, he boomed, his voice cutting through the whispers. I didn't think you had coin for carriage fare, let alone the entrance fee for Pembroke's game. Have you come to surrender the deed early? The crowd laughed, not polite laughter, the kind that draws blood. Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but Elspeth felt his arm tense beneath her hand. I've come to play Graves, he said, his voice cracking slightly, a masterful touch of feigned weakness. I found a backer, one night to turn my luck. More laughter, louder this time. A backer, Graves mocked, spreading his arms to the crowd. Who would back a three-legged horse? Very well, Ashwood. The table is open. But be warned, we play for gold here, not promises. He led the way to a private room off the main hall, smaller, quieter, lined with leather chairs and smelling of tobacco and expensive scotch. A poker table dominated the center, green baize gleaming under a chandelier. 6 chairs. 5 were already occupied by men Elspeth didn't recognize but could read clearly enough. Bankers, railroad men, industrialists, the kind of men who decided the fate of thousands with a signature. Nathaniel took the 6th chair. Elspeth stood behind him, her hands resting lightly on the back of his seat. She could feel his heartbeat through the chair, slow, steady, controlled. The game began. For the first hour, Nathaniel played like a man drowning. He bet recklessly on weak hands, folded too early on strong ones, lost steadily, painfully. The pile of chips in front of him dwindled. The other players relaxed, convinced of his incompetence. Graves won hand after hand, his pile of chips growing into a small mountain. He was drunk on victory, his movements expansive, his laugh loud and cruel. But Elspeth watched, and she saw. Every 15 minutes, Graves glanced at the clock on the mantel, a brief flick of the eyes barely noticeable, but consistent. He was waiting for something, some specific time. She touched her necklace once. Fear. Nathaniel's fingers resting on his knee beneath the table tapped once in acknowledgement. The night wore on, the stakes climbed. Nathaniel was down to his last $50 in chips. The crowd that had gathered to watch was restless, eager for the final kill. It's over, Ashwood, Graves gloated, raking in another pot. You're down to your last stake. Go home. Pack your bags. Ravencrest is mine at sunset. Nathaniel looked down at his hands. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow, also fake, Elspeth realized. Everything about his performance was calculated. One more hand, he whispered. Graves laughed. You have nothing left to bet. Nathaniel reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. The deed to Ravencrest Manor. He placed it on the table. The estate, he said quietly, unencumbered, against everything on this table, and your shipping shares in the Eastern Maritime Company. The room went silent. Graves's eyes narrowed. My shipping shares are worth 10 times your rotting estate. Then you should have no fear accepting. Nathaniel looked up, and for a split second the mask slipped. The ruined Baron vanished, and the Duke, cold, calculating, deadly, looked out through those dark eyes. Unless you're afraid. Graves slammed his hand on the table. Deal. I'll take your house and leave you to rot in the gutter where you belong. The dealer shuffled. The cards fell. 5 men around the table held their breath. Elspeth watched Graves, saw the moment he looked at his cards. saw the satisfaction bloom on his face, saw him touch his throat just once so briefly and glance again at the clock. She touched her necklace. Once, twice, 3 times. Fear, lies, desperation. Nathaniel's fingers tapped against his leg. Message received. I hold a point of 5, Graves announced, laying down his cards with a flourish, and a sequence of 4. It was a strong hand. In any normal game, it would win. The crowd murmured approval. Lord Pembroke, watching from the side, shook his head sadly. That's it then, someone muttered. Ravencrest is gone. Graves reached for the deed. Fold Ashwood. Don't embarrass your wife any further. Nathaniel's hand shot out, clamping down on Graves's wrist with shocking speed. The grip was iron, the kind of grip that came from years of swordsmanship or hand-to-hand combat. I haven't played yet, Nathaniel said. His voice had changed. No more tremor, no more weakness, deep, resonating, absolutely confident. He flipped his cards one by one. Point of 6, he said. Sequence of 5. 4 aces. The room exploded in gasps and exclamations. It was a massacre, a statistically improbable, devastatingly perfect hand. Graves's face went from red to white to purple in the space of 3 seconds. You cheated, he hissed. You surely cheated. Careful, Graves. Nathaniel released his wrist and leaned back, crossing his arms. Accusing a peer of cheating without proof is grounds for a duel, and unlike you, I do not miss. You have the devil's luck. Graves spat, standing so violently his chair toppled backward. Fine, take the pot. Take the shares. They're volatile anyway. The market's been sluggish all week. I still have my land. I'll find another way to crush you. Sit down, Nathaniel commanded. It wasn't a request. The authority in his voice was absolute, primal, the voice of a man born to command armies. Graves hesitated. Then, incredibly, he sat. The game isn't finished, Nathaniel said coldly. We bet the shares, Graves. But shares are just paper. Their value depends on the ships they represent. At that precise moment, the double doors of the room flew open. A young man burst in, disheveled and covered in mud, wearing the livery of the New York Stock Exchange. He was gasping for breath, wild-eyed, clutching a telegram. Lord Graves, he shouted. Urgent news. Graves turned confusion, and the first edge of fear reaping into his expression. I'm here. What is it? The messenger thrust out the telegram. The Lady Matilda, the Star of the West, your entire fleet, sir. Confiscated by federal authorities. Seized for smuggling opium in international waters. The Treasury Department liquidated the assets to pay the fines. The stock is worth 0. Traded at 0 as of an hour ago. Chaos. Men jumped to their feet, checking their own pocket watches, sending servants running for newspapers. Someone knocked over a glass. Someone else started shouting about their own investments in Eastern Maritime. But Nathaniel remained perfectly still. And Elspeth, watching him, understood. This was always the plan. The poker was just theater. The real game had been played hours ago with federal agents and customs officials and whatever leverage Nathaniel had accumulated over 5 years of careful preparation. Graves looked down at the telegram, his hands shaking. Then he looked up at Nathaniel, and the recognition in his eyes was terrible to see. You knew, he rasped. You arranged this. You wanted my worthless shares. You baited me into betting my cash against your estate. I didn't just know, Nathaniel said, standing slowly. He towered over the seated Graves, and now there was no pretense of weakness. This was the Duke of Ashwood, and every man in the room could see it. I arranged the federal inspection. I provided the evidence of opium smuggling. I ensured the ships would be seized at precisely 9:30 this evening. He reached across the table and picked up the deed to Ravencrest, tucking it into his pocket. Then he began gathering the mountain of cash and banknotes that represented Graves's liquid fortune. You're ruined, Graves, Nathaniel said quietly. You have no ships. Your cash is on this table, and it now belongs to me. And as for your land, he pulled a second document from his coat. I believe you'll find that the bank has called in your debts, effective immediately. Graves snatched this paper. Read it. The color drained from his face completely. You bought my mortgage, he whispered. I own you, Nathaniel corrected. Every acre, every building, every horse in your stable, and I am exercising my right as creditor to foreclose. You have until sunset tomorrow to vacate your properties. The irony hung in the air, heavy and brutal. Graves's own threat turned back on him with surgical precision. Graves's legs gave out. He fell back into the chair, all the arrogance and cruelty bleeding out of him, until there was nothing left but a broken old man staring at the ruins of his empire. Nathaniel offered his arm to Elspeth. Come, my dear, the air in here has become stale. She took his arm, her mind reeling. The entire room parted for them, not with mockery this time, but with fear, raw, genuine fear. They walked out of the Pembroke mansion, leaving a destroyed man weeping in their wake. The carriage ride back to the townhouse was silent, but it was different from the silence of the morning. This was the silence after a bomb has detonated, after the world has shifted on its axis. Elspeth watched the streetlights flicker past her hands folded in her lap. She'd just witnessed the complete annihilation of a man's fortune and reputation. And she'd helped. She'd read Graves's tells and signaled Nathaniel. She was complicit. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, she felt something else. Something darker and more satisfying. Justice, maybe. Or revenge. She waited until they were halfway back to the townhouse before she spoke. "I know you're the Duke of Ashwood," she said quietly. Nathaniel didn't look at her. He was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. "I found the letters," Elspeth continued, "the first week at Ravencrest. In the wardrobe in my room, hidden in a loose panel, letters addressed to your grace. With coded messages about networks and shipping manifests and federal investigations. You went through my things," Nathaniel stated. Not an accusation, just a fact. "I needed to know who I'd married. And now you do." He finally turned to look at her. In the shadows of the carriage, he looked weary. The thrill of the kill had faded, leaving only the weight of the crown he was hiding. The man who saved you from starvation. And the man who just destroyed another human being without blinking. They're the same person, Elspeth. Can you live with that? She thought about it, really thought, about Graves's cruelty, his threat to burn Ravencrest, about the way he'd looked at her like she was nothing, less than nothing. "Graves evicted 30 families last winter," she said slowly. "I remember. It was in the newspapers. He bought a block of tenements in the Lower East Side and cleared them out to build a warehouse. People froze in the streets. Children died." Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe. "So no," Elspeth continued. "I can't say I'm sorry to see him ruined. What happens now?" Now, Nathaniel leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Graves was the beginning. He was the pawn. But the man who actually orchestrated my fall, the man who killed my father and forced me into hiding, he's still out there. And tonight, by destroying Graves, I've just announced my return." "Thornfield." "Yes, Maxwell Thornfield, Secretary of the Treasury, whisperer in the president's ear. The man who's been stealing from the American people for a decade. He knows I'm alive now. He knows I'm coming for him, which means we're in danger." Elspeth should have been afraid. She'd signed up for food and shelter, not a war against one of the most powerful men in the government, but instead she felt a strange calm settle over her. "You said we," she pointed out. "I did. You could still send me away. A cottage in the countryside, safety." Nathaniel studied her face in the dim light. "I could. Would you go?" Elspeth thought of the bakery doorway, the hunger, the cold, the feeling of being invisible, disposable, beneath notice. Then she thought of tonight, of standing in the Pembroke mansion in an emerald dress signaling information that brought down a titan, of being seen, of mattering. "No," she said firmly. "I signed a contract, Nathaniel. To have and to hold. I didn't sign up for a quiet life in a cottage. I signed up for a roof over my head and a fight for survival." She reached out and covered his hand with hers. "If you're going to war, you'll need someone to watch the room. And I'm very good at watching." For the first time since she'd met him, Nathaniel smiled. Not the cold, dangerous smile he'd given Graves. A real smile. Small, tentative, but genuine. It transformed his face, made him look younger. Almost handsome. "Very well, my lady," he said, turning his hand to lace his fingers with hers. "But be warned. The man we're hunting next doesn't play cards. He plays with blood, with power, with the machinery of government itself. Then we'll learn to play his game." The carriage pulled up to the townhouse. Inside, the servants had prepared a late supper, cold chicken bread, cheese, wine. But neither of them was hungry. Nathaniel led Elspeth to the study. He spread papers across the desk. Maps of Washington, D.C., floor plans of government buildings, dossiers on politicians and bureaucrats. And in the center of it all, a photograph. A man in his 50s, silver-haired, handsome in a cold marble way, wearing the sash and medals of high office. Maxwell Thornfield. "He keeps the real ledger, the one proving his theft, in a private vault," Nathaniel explained. "Only one copy exists. He's paranoid about it. The vault is in his office in the Treasury building, but the key?" He tapped to the photograph. "He wears it on a chain around his neck. Never takes it off. Not to sleep, not to bathe, never. So we need to get the key. We need to steal it from the Secretary of the Treasury while he's surrounded by guards and staff in the apparatus of federal power. Elspeth studied the photograph. There's a masquerade ball at the White House in 3 days, the president's birthday celebration. Every important person in Washington will be there, including Thornfield. And us. Nathaniel pulled out an envelope, heavy cream paper, the presidential seal embossed in wax. Inside, an invitation. We received this 2 days ago, he said. It's not a request, it's a summons. Thornfield knows I'm alive. He knows I took down Graves. He wants me in the open where he can control the situation, where he can have me arrested for the old treason charges before I can speak. It's a trap. Yes, but it's also the only opportunity we'll have. Thornfield will be there, surrounded by witnesses, by politicians, by the president himself. He'll feel safe, invulnerable. That's when people make mistakes. Elspeth looked at the invitation, then at Nathaniel. What do you need me to do? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a small, wicked-looking knife, a stiletto, thin blade sharp as a razor. Thornfield has a weakness, Nathaniel said softly. He collects beautiful things, art, music, women. He'll see you as a trophy I acquired. A poverty-stricken girl dressed in silk. He'll underestimate you, see you as harmless, perhaps even be attracted to you. You want me to get close to him. I want you to dance with him. And while you're dancing, while he's distracted by his own arrogance, I want you to cut the chain and take the key. Elspeth picked up the stiletto. It was lighter than she expected. Well-balanced, deadly. Have you ever stolen anything? Nathaniel asked. She thought of the apple she'd taken from a pushcart when she was 12 and starving. The handkerchief she'd lifted from a drunk man's pocket to sell for 2 pennies. Small crimes of desperation that had kept her alive. Yes, she said, but never from someone who could have me executed for it. Can you do this? Could she? Could she stand in a ballroom full of the most powerful people in America and pick the pocket of the Secretary of the Treasury? Could she look him in the eye and smile while planning to rob him? She looked at Nathaniel, saw the hope in his eyes, the trust, the belief that she was capable of this impossible thing. And she thought of her father, of the creditors who'd taken everything, of the system that crushed people like her without thought or mercy. I can do this, she said, but I'll need practice. Over the next 2 days, Nathaniel transformed the townhouse into a training ground. Serafina arrived from Ravencrest on the 2nd day. Elspeth had assumed the old housekeeper was just that, a housekeeper. But the first thing Serafina did when she entered the study was pull a small leather case from her bag and open it to reveal a collection of lockpicks and slim tools that looked designed for opening sealed envelopes without detection. You were a thief, Elspeth said. I was the Silver Sparrow, Serafina corrected with a hint of pride. Best pickpocket in London in my day. I retired 20 years ago when the old Duke Nathaniel's father hired me to train his household staff in security. Turns out being a thief makes you excellent at preventing theft. She taught Elspeth the basics of pickpocketing in 6 hours. How to use distraction. How to make your hands independent entities, one drawing attention while the other works. How to feel for chains through fabric. How to cut without being felt. You have good hands, Serafina said approvingly. Steady, precise. Your father was a clockmaker. Yes. Good training. Clocks require delicate touch. So does this work. By the evening of the 2nd day, Elspeth could lift Nathaniel's pocket watch without him noticing. Could remove Serafina's bracelet during a conversation. Could cut a chain with the stiletto so cleanly the person wearing it wouldn't feel it until gravity pulled the pendant free. You're ready, Nathaniel said that night. But Elspeth wasn't sure. Ready for practice, maybe. Ready for the real thing she'd know tomorrow night. They spent the final evening in relative quiet. Serafina prepared a good meal, the first real feast Elspeth had eaten since her father died. Roasted chicken with herbs, fresh bread, vegetables that didn't come from a pushcart. Wine that tasted of summer and oak. Nathaniel ate sparingly, his mind clearly elsewhere. Planning, calculating contingencies, preparing for every possible failure. After dinner, he found Elspeth in the library staring at the fire. Second thoughts, he asked quietly. Third and fourth thoughts, but I'm still going. He sat beside her, not touching, just present. They'd been married for 10 days and had barely spoken beyond planning sessions and tactical discussions. But now in the quiet before the storm, Elspeth found herself wondering who he was beneath the Duke and the Baron and the spy. Tell me about her, she said. The fiancée, the one from before. Nathaniel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then Catherine Mercer, daughter of a senator. We were engaged 5 years ago. When the charges came, when I became a fugitive, her father convinced her to break the engagement. For her own protection, he said, can't be associated with a traitor. Did you love her? I thought I did. But looking back, I think I loved the idea of her. The normal life she represented, family, stability, a future that didn't involve hiding and revenge. He looked at Elspeth. She made the right choice. This life, what I've become, would have destroyed her. And you think it won't destroy me? I think you've already been destroyed once, and you rebuilt yourself from the ashes. That makes you stronger than she ever was. Elspeth didn't know what to say to that, so instead she did something impulsive, something she'd been wanting to do since the night at the Pembroke mansion. She leaned over and kissed him. Not the perfunctory kiss of their wedding, not the performance for others. A real kiss, soft, tentative. A question as much as an answer. Nathaniel froze for a heartbeat. Then his hand came up to cup her face gentle despite the calluses on his palm, and he kissed her back. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. This is a terrible idea, Nathaniel said quietly. Getting attached, caring. It makes you vulnerable. I know, Elspeth whispered, but I think it might be too late for that. They sat by the fire until it burned, low hands intertwined, not speaking. Tomorrow they would walk into the lion's den. Tomorrow they might die or be arrested or fail completely. But tonight, for a few hours, they were just two people who'd found each other in the darkness. And that was enough. The White House gleamed like a jewel box in the winter darkness. Elspeth had never seen anything like it. Every window blazed with light. Carriages lined the circular drive in a procession that stretched back half a mile, each one more ornate than the last. Women in gowns that cost more than houses stepped onto red carpets. Men in tailcoats and military dress uniforms clustered in groups, their breath fogging in the cold air as they laughed and smoked cigars. This was power. Not the crude grinding power of the Lower East Side, where landlords evicted families and factory owners worked children to death. This was refined power, the kind wielded with fountain pens and whispered words, the kind that started wars and ended them, the kind that could erase a man from existence with a signature. Elspeth touched the mask hanging from her wrist. Black velvet, simple, elegant. It would cover the upper half of her face, leaving only her mouth and chin visible. Everyone would be masked tonight. Anonymity was part of the game. Breathe, Nathaniel said quietly beside her. She realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly, watching the vapor dissipate in the frigid air. Nathaniel wore a black tailcoat that had been carefully aged. The fabric was fine, but the cuffs showed wear. The image of a man clinging to former glory. His mask was black as well, the Venetian style with a long nose. It made him look dangerous, predatory. Hidden in the folds of her gown, secured against her thigh with a ribbon garter, was the stiletto. Its blade had been sharpened that morning until it could split a hair. She'd practiced drawing it 100 times. Her hand knew the motion. Smooth, silent, deadly. Their carriage pulled up to the entrance. A footman in presidential livery opened the door, his expression carefully neutral as he took in their modest arrival. Announcement, sir. Baron Nathaniel Ashwood of Ravencrest, Nathaniel said clearly, and the Baroness Elspeth Ashwood. They climbed the steps to the entrance. The doors opened into a vision of American power. The foyer was vast, marble and gold, with a grand staircase sweeping up to the second floor. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages hung from the ceiling, dripping with light. The air smelled of expensive perfume, beeswax candles, and ambition. The ballroom beyond was a sea of masks and silk. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, swirling in carefully choreographed chaos. A string orchestra played Strauss on a raised platform. Servants circulated with champagne and oysters. Senators danced with industrialist daughters. Generals traded stories with railroad magnates. And watching it all from a dais at the far end of the room, seated in a chair that was almost but not quite a throne, was President William McKinley himself. Elspeth felt the weight of history pressing down on her. 3 days ago, she'd been a starving girl with a nickel. Now she was walking into the center of American power planning to commit a crime that could get her hanged for treason. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. He's here, Nathaniel murmured. Elspeth followed his gaze. Near the fireplace holding court with a circle of admirers stood Maxwell Thornfield. He was exactly as his photograph suggested. Mid-50s, silver hair, perfectly styled face, handsome in a cold sculptured way. He wore the sash and medals of his office, purple silk across his chest catching the candlelight. His mask was gold ornate, making him look like a Roman emperor. And around his neck, barely visible above his white collar, was a thin chain. Gold, disappearing beneath his shirt. The key. As if sensing their attention, Thornfield's gaze swept across the room and landed on them. Recognition flared in his eyes, followed immediately by calculation. He smiled. It was the smile of a cat that had just cornered a mouse. Then he started walking toward them. "Steady," Nathaniel whispered. His hand found hers squeezed once. "Remember the plan. I'll draw his attention. You observe. Wait for the opening." Thornfield cut through the crowd like a ship through water, his admirers parting before him. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no, never been denied, never been afraid. He stopped 3 feet away, that cold smile still fixed on his face. "Ashwood," he said pleasantly. His voice was smooth-cultured with a hint of Southern aristocracy. "Or should I say Duke Ashwood? It's been 5 years. We all thought you were dead. Burned to ash in that terrible fire in New York. How surprising to see you've risen from the grave." "Thornfield," Nathaniel's voice was carefully neutral. "I could say the same. I thought by now the weight of your crimes would have crushed you. Yet here you stand, how resilient corruption can be." The words were civil. The subtext was war. Thornfield's smile didn't waver. His gaze slid to Elspeth, and she felt it like oil on her skin. Assessing, cataloging, reducing her to an object. "And this charming creature must be the new wife," he said. "The baker's daughter, I heard. How delightfully democratic of you, Ashwood. Marrying beneath your station. Though I suppose when one is living in ruins, any companionship is better than none." Elspeth felt rage flash hot in her chest, but she forced herself to smile, to curtsy with just a hint of mockery. "Hunger sharpens many things, Secretary Thornfield," she said sweetly. "Perspective, judgment, the ability to recognize predators. You should try it sometime." For just a second, Thornfield's mask slipped. Surprise flickered across his face. He'd expected a timid mouse easily cowed by his presence. Instead, he'd gotten teeth. He recovered quickly. Laughed a dry, rattling sound. "Delightful," he said. "You've trained her well, Ashwood. Tell me, does she know what she's married into? Does she understand that her husband is a wanted fugitive? That I could have federal marshals arrest you both right now in front of the president himself?" "Then why don't you?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "Because this is much more entertaining." Thornfield's eyes glittered behind his golden mask. "Watching you scramble. Watching you play your little games. You took down Graves, congratulations. But Cornelius was always expendable. A useful tool, nothing more. Did you really think bankrupting one banker would hurt me?" "No," Nathaniel said, "but it was a pleasant start." Thornfield leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for them. "You can't win, boy. I have the president's ear. I have senators and judges and generals in my pocket. I have the entire apparatus of the federal government at my disposal. You're one man, a ghost, a memory of a dead duke. What can you possibly do to me?" Nathaniel smiled, that cold, dangerous smile Elspeth had seen twice before. "I can make you bleed," he said softly. "And I can make sure everyone watches while I do it." The orchestra struck up a waltz. Couples moved onto the dance floor, masks glittering in the candlelight. Thornfield stepped back, his pleasant expression sliding back into place. "How rude of me," he said, extending his hand to Elspeth. "I haven't asked the lady to dance. May I, Baroness? I should very much like to know the woman who's chosen to die alongside this fool." It wasn't really a question. It was a command, a test. Elspeth looked at Nathaniel. He gave the smallest nod. She took Thornfield's hand. His grip was firm, possessive, the hand of a man used to owning things. He led her onto the floor, one arm around her waist, holding her closer than propriety demanded. The waltz began. They moved in perfect rhythm. Thornfield was an excellent dancer, his movements practiced and precise. "You're playing a dangerous game, child," he murmured as they spun. "Ashwood is a traitor and a thief, a man who embezzled millions and let his own father take the blame. Did he tell you that part of the story?" "He told me his version," Elspeth said carefully. "I'm sure yours is different. Mine has the benefit of being true." Thornfield's eyes never left her face. 5 years ago, Duke Edmund Ashwood conducted an audit of the Treasury. What he found was evidence of systematic embezzlement, but the embezzler was his own son. Nathaniel had been gambling, you see. Cards, horses, women. He'd run up debts of nearly $2 million. Elspeth let him talk, kept her expression neutral, watchful. When Edmund discovered the truth, he tried to cover it up, protect his son, but the evidence was too damning. I had no choice but to bring charges. Thornfield sighed, a perfect imitation of regret. Edmund couldn't live with the shame. The hunting accident, I believe it was suicide. And Nathaniel, rather than face justice, staged his own death and fled. Now he's back in spinning lies, trying to destroy good men to cover his own crimes. It was a good story, plausible, well-rehearsed. Elspeth could almost believe it if she hadn't seen the calculation in Thornfield's eyes. If she hadn't watched him arrange Graves's destruction with such cold precision. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you still have a chance to save yourself." Thornfield pulled her closer as they turned. His breath was hot against her ear. "Leave him. Testify against him. Tell the truth about his plans. I can offer you immunity, protection, even a small pension. You'd never be hungry again." His hand on her waist slid lower. Not quite improper, but close. Testing boundaries. "All you have to do," he whispered, "is tell me where he's hidden the documents he stole from Graves. The bank records, the shipping manifests. He has them somewhere. In that pitiful townhouse, perhaps, or did he leave them at Ravencrest?" And there it was. The real reason for the dance. The real reason for the offer. Thornfield was afraid. Beneath the confidence and the power and the presidential connections, he was genuinely afraid of what Nathaniel might have uncovered. Elspeth let herself stumble slightly as if dizzy. She put her hand on Thornfield's chest to steady herself. Through the fabric of his shirt and waistcoat, she felt the chain. Thin, gold, running down from his neck. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice breathy, frightened. "Nathaniel doesn't confide in me. I was just desperate. Hungry. He offered food and shelter. That's all." "Of course," Thornfield said soothingly. His hand on her back moved in what might have been a comforting gesture, or possessive. "You're an innocent in all this, which is why I'm giving you this chance. Think about it, my dear. Do you really want to go down with a sinking ship?" The waltz ended. Couples stopped, applauded politely. The orchestra began setting up for the next dance. Thornfield escorted Elspeth back to the edge of the floor, his hand lingering on her arm. "Consider my offer," he said quietly. "You have until midnight. After that, I'm afraid sentiment won't protect you from justice." He bowed and disappeared into the crowd. Elspeth's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her sides, willing them to be still. Nathaniel appeared at her elbow. "Well, he's terrified," she whispered. "He's trying to find out what evidence you have, where it's hidden. He thinks I'm weak, malleable. He tried to buy me." "Good. That means he still underestimates you." Nathaniel handed her a glass of champagne. "Did you feel the chain?" "Yes, thin gold, runs straight down from his neck. Under the shirt, probably hooked to a pocket in his waistcoat." "Can you reach it?" Elspeth thought about the dance, about how close Thornfield had held her, how his hands had wandered. "If he dances with me again, if he's distracted enough." She looked at Nathaniel. "How do we make sure he asks me again?" Nathaniel's smile was predatory. "We make him jealous." For the next hour, Nathaniel made a show of parading Elspeth through the ballroom, dancing with her, laughing with her, touching her in ways that were just barely acceptable in public, making it clear to everyone watching that she was his, valued, desired. And across the room, Elspeth could feel Thornfield watching. His gaze never left her for long. She'd insulted him earlier with her sharp tongue. She'd rejected his offer. And now Nathaniel was flaunting her like a prize. To a man like Thornfield, a collector, a possessor of beautiful things, it was intolerable. The clock struck 11, 1 hour until Thornfield's deadline. The orchestra began a new waltz, and like clockwork, Thornfield appeared. "Another dance, Baroness?" he asked, not looking at Nathaniel at all. "Before the evening ends." Elspeth glanced at Nathaniel. He gave the slightest nod. "I'd be delighted, Secretary," she said. This time Thornfield held her even closer. His hand on her waist was firmly possessive now, all pretense of propriety abandoned. "You're making a mistake," he said as they began to move. "Ashwood can't protect you. He can't even protect himself. By midnight, I'll have federal marshals surrounding this building. You'll both be arrested for treason. Unless I betray him. Unless you come to your senses." Thornfield's voice was honey and poison. "You're a beautiful woman, Elspeth. Clever. You deserve better than a ruined duke and a crumbling estate. I could offer you so much more. Comfort, security, a place in society." His meaning was clear, unmistakable. Elspeth forced herself not to recoil. Instead, she leaned closer as if considering his words, as if tempted. "What would I have to do?" she whispered. Triumph flashed in Thornfield's eyes. "Just tell me where the documents are, that's all. A simple piece of information, and in exchange I'll make you wealthy, protected. You'll never be hungry again. They turned spinning through the crowd. Elspeth let herself sway against him as if overwhelmed by the offer. By his proximity, her hand rested on his shoulder. The other was trapped in his grip. I think, she breathed, I think he keeps them in the library, at Ravencrest, in a hidden compartment in the desk. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but Thornfield believed it. She saw the satisfaction bloom on his face. Good girl, he murmured. You've made the right choice. He pulled her closer, his hand sliding dangerously low on her back. His other hand released hers, moving to her waist. Both arms around her, now holding her in an embrace that was no longer a dance, but something else entirely. After tonight, he whispered into her hair, you'll want for nothing, I promise you that. And because both his hands were occupied, because his attention was focused on his victory, on his conquest, he never felt Elspeth's freed hand slide between them, never felt her fingers find the chain through his shirt, never felt the stiletto appear in her other hand, pulled from the garter on her thigh in one smooth motion. She found the chain, located the clasp at the back of his neck. The stiletto blade was so sharp, it cut through the thin gold links like butter. The chain parted. Gravity did the rest. The key slid down inside Thornfield's waistcoat, caught in the fabric. Elspeth swayed as if truly dizzy now. She stumbled against Thornfield's chest, her hand pressing against his waistcoat. Her fingers found the key through the fabric, closed around it. Forgive me, she gasped. I feel faint. The crowd, the heat. Of course, of course. Thornfield was all concerned now, the predator showing care for his prey. Let me escort you to the terrace. Some air will help. But as he reached to take her arm, Elspeth's hand slipped into his waistcoat pocket in one fluid motion. The key came free, palmed, expertly disappeared into the folds of her gown. No, I just need to sit, she said, pulling away. Please, I'm fine, just overwhelmed. She backed away into the crowd before Thornfield could stop her, turned, walked quickly toward the edge of the ballroom where Nathaniel waited. She pressed the key into his hand. Done, she whispered. Nathaniel's fingers closed around it. Then he pulled her close, kissed her forehead. You're magnificent, he breathed. But there was no time for celebration. Behind them, Elspeth heard a roar of fury. Thornfield had discovered the theft. Stop them! His voice cut through the music, through the conversation, through everything. Stop Ashwood and the woman, they're thieves, they're traitors. The music died, conversation stopped. Every head in the ballroom turned. Thornfield was standing in the center of the floor, his mask torn off his face, purple with rage. His hand was at his throat, feeling the severed chain. Guards, he screamed. Arrest them! Now federal marshals materialized from the edges of the room, 6 of them moving with military precision, hands on their weapons. The crowd parted. A clear path opened between the marshals and where Nathaniel and Elspeth stood. Elspeth's heart hammered. This was it, the end game. They had the key, but they were surrounded, trapped. Nathaniel's hand found hers, squeezed once. Then he did something Elspeth didn't expect. He laughed, not nervous laughter, not desperate, but genuine, amused laughter that echoed through the silent ballroom. You're right, Thornfield, he called out, his voice carried to every corner of the room. I am a thief. I did steal something tonight, but not what you think. He held up the key, the small brass key that had hung around Thornfield's neck. This opens a vault in the Treasury building, Nathaniel continued, a private vault that contains a ledger, a very special ledger that documents every penny Maxwell Thornfield has stolen from the American people over the past decade. $2 million, embezzled, laundered, hidden in offshore accounts. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Senators looked at each other. Generals frowned. Even President McKinley was leaning forward in his chair, listening intently. Lies, Thornfield shouted. All lies. He's a wanted fugitive, a traitor. Don't listen to him. Then explain the key, Nathaniel said calmly. If you have nothing to hide, why do you wear a key to a secret vault around your neck at all times? Why guard it so carefully? Thornfield's mouth opened, closed. No answer came. My father discovered your crimes 5 years ago. Nathaniel continued, his voice ringing with controlled fury. Duke Edmund Ashwood conducted an audit and found evidence of systematic theft. He was going to present it to President McKinley. But you had him killed, made it look like a hunting accident. Then you turned the accusation on him. On me. Forced me to flee or hang for crimes I didn't commit. Prove it, Thornfield snarled. You have a key, so what? That proves nothing. You're right, Nathaniel agreed. The key alone proves nothing. But the ledger it opens, that proves everything. Every transaction, Every forged signature, every offshore account, all in your handwriting. Signed, dated, sealed. He turned to face President McKinley. Mr. President, I am Nathaniel Ashwood, rightful Duke of the Ashwood line. I formally request a federal investigation into Secretary Thornfield's conduct. I have evidence, shipping manifests, bank records, testimony from witnesses. And now, with this key access to the final proof, I ask only for the chance to present this evidence to you and to Congress. Let the truth decide who is the traitor here. Silence. President McKinley stood. He was a small man balding with a neat mustache and eyes that had seen too many wars, but he carried himself with dignity. Secretary Thornfield, McKinley said quietly, do you wear a key around your neck? Mr. President, this is absurd. You can't possibly. Do you wear a key? McKinley repeated, his voice harder now. Thornfield's hand went to his throat, to the severed chain still hanging there. Yes, he said finally, but it's merely personal effects, nothing to do with... Then you won't mind if we examine this vault, McKinley said. Tonight, now, with witnesses. Thornfield went white, then red, then white again. Mr. President, I must protest. This is... Guards, McKinley said. Detain Secretary Thornfield. Hold him until we can verify these claims. If the vault contains what Duke Ashwood suggests, we'll proceed accordingly. If it doesn't, he looked at Nathaniel, then you'll be the one in chains. The federal marshals moved, but not toward Nathaniel, toward Thornfield. Thornfield backed away. No, you can't do this. I'm the Secretary of the Treasury. I have immunity. You have the right to remain silent, one of the marshals said, grabbing Thornfield's arm. I suggest you exercise it. They hauled him away, still protesting, still struggling. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the second most powerful man in the government was dragged from the ballroom like a common criminal. President McKinley descended from his dais and approached Nathaniel. Duke Ashwood, he said formally, if your evidence is as compelling as you suggest, you'll have your investigation. But if you're lying to me, if this is some elaborate revenge scheme, you'll hang for treason. Do you understand? I understand, Mr. President, Nathaniel said, and I welcome the scrutiny. I've waited 5 years for the truth to come to light. I can wait a few more hours. McKinley nodded, then his gaze shifted to Elspeth. And you, madam, the Baroness who dances with secretaries and picks their pockets. What role do you play in this drama? Elspeth curtsied, her legs shaking but her voice steady. I'm just a baker's daughter, Mr. President, who happened to marry a duke, and who happened to believe that justice matters more than power. McKinley studied her for a long moment. Then incredibly he smiled. Well said, Baroness. He turned to his aides. Mum and the Attorney General, and someone fetch the key to the Treasury building. We're opening that vault tonight. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of marshals and government officials tromping through the Treasury building. 3 hours of unlocking doors and examining documents. 3 hours of Elspeth and Nathaniel sitting in a guarded room, not knowing if they'd won or if they were about to be executed. Elspeth's hand never left Nathaniel's. Their fingers were laced together so tightly they'd gone numb. Whatever happens, Nathaniel said quietly, thank you for believing me, for helping me, for being brave when you had every reason to run. We're not dead yet, Elspeth whispered. Don't start eulogizing. At 2 in the morning, the door opened. President McKinley entered, flanked by the Attorney General and 3 senators. His face was grave. Elspeth's heart stopped. Then McKinley spoke. The vault has been opened, the ledger examined, and I owe you an apology, Duke Ashwood. On behalf of the United States government, I formally apologize for the injustice done to you and to your father's memory. Elspeth felt tears sting her eyes. Beside her, Nathaniel went very still. Maxwell Thornfield has been arrested on charges of embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder, McKinley continued. His assets are being seized, his co-conspirators identified. The evidence you provided combined with what we found in the vault is overwhelming. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Welcome home, Duke Ashwood. Your name is cleared, your father's honor restored, and the nation thanks you for your service in exposing this corruption. Nathaniel stood on shaking legs. He took the president's hand. Thank you, Mr. President. McKinley turned to Elspeth. And as for you, Baroness the Duchess, I should say the Treasury Department owes you a debt. Without your unconventional skills, this evidence might never have come to light. He bowed. The President of the United States bowed to a baker's daughter from the Lower East Side. I trust you'll use those skills for good in the future, he said with a slight smile. Elspeth managed a curtsy. I'll do my best, sir. They walked out of the Treasury building at dawn. The city was waking up, shopkeepers opening their doors, street sweepers at their work. Newsboys already hawking papers with massive headlines, Secretary Thornfield arrested, Duke Ashwood exonerated. Conspiracy exposed. Nathaniel and Elspeth stood on the steps of the building, watching the sun rise over Washington. "It's over," Elspeth whispered. "No," Nathaniel said. "It's just beginning." The trial of Maxwell Thornfield took place 3 weeks later in a packed courtroom at the Supreme Court. Elspeth sat in the gallery watching as prosecutors presented mountains of evidence. The ledger from Thornfield's vault, bank records showing the embezzlement, testimony from witnesses who'd been too afraid to speak before, and finally the testimony of Duke Nathaniel Ashwood himself laying out 5 years of investigation in meticulous detail. Thornfield's lawyers fought desperately. They claimed the evidence was forged, that Nathaniel was a vengeful madman, that the entire case was a political witch hunt. But the evidence was too strong, the crimes too clear, the corruption too deep to deny. On the 7th day of the trial, the verdict came down. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Maxwell Thornfield to life in prison. His fortune was confiscated. His co-conspirators, including the men who'd actually murdered Duke Edmund during the hunting trip, were arrested and charged as accessories to murder. When the verdict was read, Thornfield didn't scream or protest. He simply sagged in his chair, all the arrogance and power draining out of him, until he looked like what he'd always been beneath the expensive suits and political connections. A hollow man, a thief, a murderer. Elspeth felt no satisfaction in his destruction, no joy in his downfall, just a quiet sense that the scales had finally balanced, that justice for once had been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. But Nathaniel ignored them all. He took Elspeth's hand and led her to a waiting carriage. "Where to your grace?" the driver asked. Nathaniel looked at Elspeth. "Home." She smiled. "Yes, home." 6 months later, Ravencrest Manor had been transformed. The roof was repaired, the windows replaced, the ivy trimmed back to something manageable instead of consuming. Fresh paint covered the walls. The gardens had been cleared and replanted. Light poured through clean windows into rooms that had stood dark for years. But it wasn't just a restoration. It was a reimagining. The East Wing, the part that had been damaged beyond repair, had been demolished and rebuilt as something new. A school, with classrooms and dormitories and a library stocked with books. The Ashwood Academy for Disadvantaged Youth, the sign above the door read. It was Elspeth's idea. Nathaniel had wanted to restore Ravencrest to its former glory, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. But Elspeth had seen a different possibility. "We have the money," she'd argued. "We have the space. We have a second chance. Why waste it on empty rooms when we could fill them with children who need what we needed: safety, education, hope?" Nathaniel had agreed immediately. Now 50 children lived at Ravencrest, orphans from the Lower East Side, children whose parents had died or abandoned them, street urchins who'd been surviving on theft and luck. They were given beds, meals, education, reading and writing and mathematics, trade skills, carpentry, mechanics, bookkeeping. Serafina ran the household with the same fierce efficiency she'd always had, but now she had a staff of 20 to help her. Teachers hired from the best schools, tradesmen who taught practical skills, a doctor who lived on the grounds and treated the children for free. It was chaotic, loud, nothing like the silent, decaying manor Elspeth had first entered 8 months ago. It was perfect. On a warm afternoon in August, Elspeth stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds. Below, children played in the gardens. Their laughter rose like music. Nathaniel joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Elspeth thought about it, about the hunger and the fear and the desperation that had driven her to accept a marriage contract from a stranger, about the danger and the lies and the impossible gamble that had nearly cost them everything. "Not one," she said. Nathaniel pulled a small box from his pocket, opened it. Inside was a ring, not the paste jewelry she'd worn to the Pembroke mansion, but a real diamond. Simple, elegant, beautiful. "We were married for convenience," he said, "for survival, for strategy. But that's not what this is anymore. So I'm asking you again, Elspeth, not as a duke to a desperate girl, but as a man to a woman he loves. Will you marry me? Really marry me?" Elspeth looked at the ring, then at the man holding it. The man who'd been a stranger, then an ally, then a partner, then something deeper than any of those words could capture. "I already said yes once," she said, "in a cold church with no witnesses and no hope. I'll say it again now, in the sunlight, with our whole lives ahead of us." She held out her hand. He slipped the ring onto her finger. They kissed as the sun set over Ravencrest, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Below, the children played. The school bell rang, calling them in for dinner. Serafina shouted orders to the kitchen staff. Life continued messy and chaotic and beautiful. Nathaniel and Elspeth stood together on the balcony, watching the world they'd built from the ashes of their old lives. "Do you remember the first day we met?" Nathaniel asked. "When I said love had no place in this house?" "I remember. I was wrong." He turned to face her, his hands framing her face. "Love is the only thing that has a place here. It's what we built this on, what we fought for, what we'll pass on to every child who walks through those doors." Elspeth smiled. "That's very poetic for a man who used to communicate in grunts and door slams. You've had a civilizing influence. Or you've just gotten soft." "That too." They laughed. And in that laughter was everything they'd survived, everything they'd overcome, every impossible victory and narrow escape and moment of terror that had somehow against all odds led them here. To home, to safety, to love. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house had quieted, Elspeth found herself in the library. The same room where Nathaniel had spent so many nights plotting his revenge. But the atmosphere was different now. The coded messages were gone. The maps had been replaced with lesson plans. The candles that had burned until dawn now sat cold and unused. She pulled out her father's old pocket watch, the one thing she'd managed to keep from her old life. It still kept perfect time, still ticked with the precision her father had built into every gear. Nathaniel found her there, holding the watch, staring at nothing. "Thinking about him?" he asked. "Always," she said, wondering if he'd be proud or horrified. "I became a thief, Nathaniel. I stole from the Secretary of the Treasury. I helped bring down a government official. That's not exactly the life he imagined for me." "No," Nathaniel agreed, "but you also saved lives, changed the system that killed him, built something that will help hundreds of children avoid the fate you almost suffered. I think he'd call that a fair trade." Elspeth closed the watch, slipped it into her pocket. "I hope so." They stood together in the quiet library, surrounded by books and memories and the ghosts of who they'd been. "No more running," Nathaniel said. "No more hiding. No more revenge. Just this. Building something good. Raising children who'll change the world. Growing old together." Sounds boring," Elspeth teased. "Sounds perfect." And it was. The story of Elspeth Harrow and Nathaniel Ashwood became legend in the years that followed. The baker's daughter who married a duke and helped expose the greatest corruption scandal in American history. The fugitive noble who fought for 5 years to clear his name and avenge his father. But they didn't think of themselves as legends. They thought of themselves as survivors. Two people who'd been broken by the world and had somehow found each other in the wreckage. Two people who'd decided that survival wasn't enough, they wanted to build something better. Ravencrest Academy thrived. Its first students graduated and went on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, craftsmen. They carried with them the lessons they'd learned, that poverty isn't a moral failing, that everyone deserves a chance, that the powerful have a duty to protect the powerless. Elspeth and Nathaniel grew old together in the house that had once been a tomb and was now very much alive. They filled it with laughter and children and hope. They built a legacy not of wealth or power, but of compassion and justice. And on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the stars were bright over Connecticut, they would sit on the balcony together and remember. Remember the hunger, the fear, the desperation. Remember the poker game, the masked ball, the moment a key was stolen and an empire fell. Remember that they'd started as strangers bound by a contract and had become partners bound by choice. "Do you ever miss it?" Elspeth would ask sometimes. "The danger, the thrill, the high stakes." And Nathaniel would smile and shake his head. "I have everything I need right here," he'd say. "Everything we fought for, everything we almost lost. I'm not giving that up for anything." They would sit in the darkness, hands intertwined, and watch their empire of hope growing strong beneath the stars. This was their victory, not the public vindication or the restored title or the wealth reclaimed. This, the quiet moments, the shared glances, the knowledge that they'd survived the worst the world could throw at them and had come out stronger on the other side. They'd started with nothing but hunger and hope. They'd built a kingdom. And they truly lived in the house that love had transformed from a ruin into a home.